wasn't even supposed to be working that day. I had planned to sleep in, maybe grab a coffee, enjoy my morning like any other overworked teacher on his day off. Then my phone rang. It was Ms. Carter, the assistant principal from PS 118 in Manhattan. I had subbed there a few times before. Nothing too crazy, just the usual chaos that comes with a room full of fourth graders. Hey, Mr. Callahan, we're in a bit of a bind. Our fourth grade teacher, Ms. Thompson, called in sick last night. Can you cover for her today? I hesitated. The idea of dragging myself into a classroom full of hyperactive kids didn't exactly thrill me, but extra cash is extra cash. Yeah, sure. What time do you need me? ASAP. Just head straight to room 4B when you get here. There was something off about the way she said it, like she was rushing to get me in before I could ask too many questions. I got dressed, grabbed my keys, and headed to the school, figuring it'd be just another typical day. I was wrong. I stepped into the school expecting the usual morning chaos, kids running through the halls, teachers shouting last-minute instructions before class. But instead, it was quiet. Too quiet. The front desk clerk barely looked at me as she slid a key across the counter. 4B, she muttered before quickly looking away. Weird. I walked through the halls, passing classroom after classroom, each filled with the usual buzz of chatter and the occasional teacher reminding students to focus. Then I reached room 4B. I opened the door and stopped cold. The kids were already in their seats, staring straight ahead, perfectly silent. No talking, no fidgeting, no whispering. That's when I noticed something else. Every single desk was facing forward, except for one. An empty seat in the middle of the room, its chair turned ever so slightly, like someone had been sitting there but left in a hurry. A chill ran down my spine. Something about that classroom felt wrong. I cleared my throat and forced a smile. Good morning, class. No one responded. I set my bag down on the teacher's desk, feeling every single pair of eyes locked onto me. Normally, fourth graders can't sit still for more than 10 seconds. These kids, they didn't move. All right, let's start with a whisper. I stopped mid-sentence. It was faint, like a breeze slipping through the cracks of a door. I scanned the room, but all the kids were still facing forward, expressionless. Weird. I took attendance, trying to keep my voice light. Elliot Harper, a boy in the second row, pale as a sheet, raised his hand slowly. His fingers twitched slightly. Here. His voice was barely above a whisper. I moved down the list, noticing something strange. There was one extra name on the roster, but no one responded when I called it. I frowned. Maybe a typo? That's when I heard it again. A whisper, right behind me. I spun around. Nothing. Just the whiteboard. I exhaled slowly. Okay, Callahan, pull it together. It's just kids being weird. I walked over to my desk and pulled out the stack of worksheets Ms. Carter had left for me. All right, guys, let's start with... A sharp snap echoed through the room. I turned just in time to see Elliot crouching on the floor near the teacher's desk. His small hands clutched something metallic, a stapler, and next to him, another student. His face twisted in shock and pain was gripping his forehead. Blood dripped down his temple. For a split second, the room remained frozen. No one screamed. No one ran for help. Then, without warning, Elliot slammed the stapler down again. Snap. A second staple, right into the boy's skin. I lunged forward, yanking the stapler from his hands. What the hell are you doing? Elliot didn't react. He just looked up at me, his lips slightly parted, his pupils blown wide. Then he whispered, so softly I almost didn't hear it. He told me to. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I turned to the injured boy, blood now trickling down his forehead in thin, slow lines. His eyes were wide, not with pain, but with something else. Fear. Elliot, I said, gripping his shoulders. Who told you to do this? He blinked, once, twice. Then, in a voice barely above a breath, he murmured, "The teacher." I stiffened. Ms. Thompson? Elliot shook his head. I felt a sharp chill crawl up my spine. The other kids still hadn't moved. They just sat there watching. My instincts kicked in. I needed to get the injured student to the nurse's office. I grabbed his hand and helped him up. That's when the door slammed shut. Not like someone had closed it, like something had thrown it shut. The classroom fell into complete suffocating silence. I swallowed hard, turning back to the students. All right, enough games. Who did this? Elliot pointed to the empty chair in the middle of the room. My breath hitched. The chair that had been slightly turned when I arrived. It was now facing the front. I reached for my phone, my fingers shaking. I needed to call for help, but as soon as I looked at the screen, my stomach dropped. The screen was nothing but static. A low hum filled the room, vibrating in my bones. The fluorescent lights flickered violently. Then, I heard it. A voice, deep, metallic, and crawling under my skin like cold fingers. Class is in session. The children stood up in unison. Elliot's lips stretched into a smile too wide for his face. I backed away, my heels hitting the desk. What is this? Then I saw it. A reflection in the window. Something tall. Something wrong. It loomed over the class, its face an empty black void, its arms stretching unnaturally. The lights exploded, plunging the room into darkness. I felt a hand grip my shoulder, and then silence. The next morning, the principal, Mr. Reeves, sipped his coffee as he flipped through a thin folder. Another one? His secretary asked, peeking into his office. He sighed, tapping the folder against the desk. Yeah, Callahan's gone. She hesitated. Should we, I don't know, shut down room 4B? The principal looked up at her, his expression unreadable. No, we need a new substitute. He leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting to the classroom camera feed, where the children of room 4B sat at their desks, waiting. I had been teaching for a few years, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened in room 302. Lincoln High School was supposed to be just another job, another classroom, another group of kids. The first few weeks were fine. Same routine, same teenage drama. But then I noticed him, the kid in the back row. I didn't recognize him, and that was weird. I made it a point to learn my students' names fast, but this one, I had nothing. He never raised his hand, never spoke, never turned in any assignments. Just sat there staring at the board, like he was barely present. At first I figured he was one of those quiet kids who kept to themselves. No big deal. But when I took attendance, his name wasn't on my list. I frowned, scanning the classroom. Benjamin? No one answered. The other students looked at me like I was crazy. I cleared my throat and moved on, making a mental note to check with the office later. Maybe he was a late transfer and they hadn't updated the records. It had to be something simple like that. But then things got weirder. The next day I tried something different. When I handed out an assignment, I watched him. Everyone else was scribbling away, but his desk? Empty. No pencil, no paper, nothing. I walked over casually. Hey, you need something to write with? No response. He just stared at the board, like I wasn't even there. I glanced around expecting one of the other students to react. Someone had to notice this, right? But nobody looked his way. Nobody seemed to see him at all. That was the moment my stomach twisted. That night I went through my class roster again. No Benjamin. No extra student. I checked the school's online database. Nothing. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe I'd just made a mistake. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. A few days later, it happened. It was a cloudy Wednesday and the classroom had that sluggish midweek energy. I was in the middle of explaining symbolism in To Kill a Mockingbird when I glanced toward the back of the room. He was there. Same blank stare. Same stiff posture. And then, he wasn't. I blinked, my brain scrambling to process what I'd just seen. One second he was sitting there, and the next his seat was completely empty. A cold chill crawled up my spine. I turned toward the class. Did anyone see that? A few students looked up, confused. See what? One of them asked. I felt my throat tighten. The kid in the back, the one sitting right there. Silence. Their blank stares told me everything I needed to know. They had no idea what I was talking about. My pulse pounded in my ears as I turned back toward the empty desk. My stomach twisted. I wasn't losing it, was I? That night, I decided I needed answers. After my last class, I went straight to the school's records office. If the administration had messed up the attendance list, maybe I could clear this up. The office was small and smelled like old books and coffee. A tired-looking secretary glanced up as I stepped inside. "Hey, Mrs. Harper," she said. "Something wrong?" I hesitated. I need to check something. I think there's a student who isn't on my roster." She frowned. "Which student?" I hesitated again. Saying his name out loud felt strange. "Benjamin." The second the name left my mouth, the secretary's expression shifted. Something flickered in her eyes. "Benjamin Foster?" she asked slowly. A chill ran down my spine. "Yeah," I said carefully. "That's him." She let out a slow breath, shaking her head. "That's not possible." I swallowed. "Why?" She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Because Benjamin Foster died in room 302, over 10 years ago." I didn't sleep that night. I kept replaying the secretary's words over and over in my head. Died in room 302, over 10 years ago. I needed to know what happened. By morning, I was running on caffeine and anxiety. The second I got to school, I went back to the records office. The secretary hesitated when she saw me, but I didn't give her a chance to turn me away. "I need to see everything you have on Benjamin Foster," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She sighed, but after a moment she disappeared into the back room and returned with an old faded file. "I shouldn't be showing you this," she muttered. I barely heard her. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages. Benjamin Foster, Jr., good student, quiet, cause of death, accidental fall. The details were vague, but the report said he had been staying late after class when he somehow fell from the second-floor railing near room 302. Some students claimed they heard him scream before he hit the ground. Others said they never heard a sound. But one thing was clear. He died right outside my classroom. A heavy weight settled in my chest. Why was he still here? That night, I dreamed of room 302. I was standing at my desk. The room was empty. The air felt thick, suffocating. Then I saw him. Benjamin stood in the back, just like always. But this time, he looked different. His face wasn't blank anymore. It was desperate. "You can see me," he whispered. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't listen. My heart pounded in my chest. "What do you want?" I asked. His lips trembled. He took a step closer. "They never listened," he murmured. "They said it was an accident, but it wasn't." A cold wave of realization crashed over me. Before I could say anything else, he faded. I woke up, gasping. The next day, I walked into room 302 with a decision already made. I wasn't going to ignore him anymore. If Benjamin Foster had a story to tell, I was going to listen. And this time, I wasn't going to look away. I never liked being alone in a classroom after dark. There's something about the way the empty chairs and silent hallways stretch into the night that makes the whole place feel off. But that night, I stayed late, grading papers in room 103 at Brooklyn High School, unaware that my life was about to take a terrifying turn. It all started earlier that week when Mr. Harris, our school janitor, brought in something strange. "Found this in storage," he said, setting it down near my desk. Figured it might be good for your art class. I turned to see a life-sized wax doll, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, its glassy eyes staring straight ahead. It had an unsettling realism, so detailed that for a second, I thought it was breathing. "Where exactly did you find it?" I asked, feeling a shiver run down my spine. Mr. Harris scratched his head. "Basement storage. That room's been locked for years. Didn't even know we had this thing. Despite my gut screaming, this is a bad idea, I let him place the doll in the back of the classroom. Maybe the students would find it interesting. The next day they did, just not in the way I expected. The kids were freaked out. "Miss, that thing is cursed," Jake, one of my more skeptical students, muttered, eyeing the doll. "It's giving me the creeps." Some students laughed, others dared each other to touch it. Emily, one of my best students, refused to even look at it. "I swear its face changed," she whispered to me. At first I thought it was just their imagination running wild, until I noticed something weird. The doll wasn't where we left it. I was sure Mr. Harris had placed it in the back corner of the room, but now it was closer to my desk. "All right, who moved it?" I asked. Silence. That's when Jake pulled out his phone and took a picture. He stared at the screen for a long moment before his face lost all color. "Miss, look at this," he said, voice barely above a whisper. In the photo, the doll's eyes were locked on him, but when we looked at the actual doll, its gaze was still straight ahead. The air in the room felt suddenly colder. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The rain hammered against the windows of room 103, the sound drowning out the faint hum of the school's old fluorescent lights. The hallways were empty, and the only other person in the building was Mr. Harris mopping somewhere on the first floor. I should have gone home. I should have left. But I had a stack of midterms to grade, and I figured the storm would die down by the time I finished. I sighed, stretching my arms, and glanced at the back of the room, where the wax doll sat. Except, it wasn't there. My heart dropped. The chair was empty. A loud thud echoed from behind me. I spun around so fast that I nearly knocked over my coffee. The doll was there, right by the door. I sucked in a breath. I was alone. The door had been locked. I forced myself to move, stepping cautiously toward it. Up close, I could see details I hadn't noticed before. The cracks in the wax, the faint, eerie smile that hadn't been there before. Then it happened. The head moved. A slow, deliberate tilt, just enough to let me know it wasn't my imagination. I couldn't breathe. I grabbed my phone, trying to shine the flashlight on it, but my hands were shaking too much. A loud buzzing noise filled the air, static from the classroom's old intercom system. And then, in the middle of that stormy, empty school, I heard a whisper. "Let me out." I don't remember grabbing my stuff. I don't remember running down the hallway. I just remember the sheer terror as I bolted through the school, rain slamming against the windows, the fluorescent lights flickering above me. By the time I reached the main doors, Mr. Harris was there, looking at me like I had lost my mind. "Miss, what's wrong?" I opened my mouth to tell him everything, but then stopped. What was I supposed to say? A doll just spoke to me? It moved on its own? Instead, I just shook my head. Nothing. Just needed some air. The next morning, Emily didn't show up to class. At first, no one thought much of it. Kids miss school all the time. But when her best friend Megan said Emily had been acting weird the night before, talking about having nightmares of the doll standing over her bed, I felt that same cold fear creeping back in. During lunch, I found the principal and asked to check the security cameras. That's when I saw it. Emily was walking down the hallway alone. She kept looking over her shoulder, as if someone was following her. At first, I thought it was just paranoia, until I saw the shadow, a dark figure just barely visible at the edge of the frame. And then, as Emily turned a corner, she was gone. But the shadow, it stayed. And when the camera panned slightly to the left, the wax doll was standing at the end of the hallway. But here's the thing. It wasn't in the classroom anymore. I felt numb as I stared at the security footage. The principal, Mr. Lawrence, rewound the video, playing it again. The same thing. Emily vanishing. The wax doll standing at the end of the hallway. "That's impossible," Mr. Lawrence muttered. "It must be some kind of glitch." A glitch. That's what he wanted to believe. But I knew better. I had to find Mr. Harris. I tracked him down in the janitor's closet, organizing old boxes. "Where did that doll really come from?" I demanded. His face went pale. "You weren't supposed to move it," he muttered. "It was locked away for a reason." That cold fear tightened around my chest. "What are you talking about?" Mr. Harris sighed, rubbing his face. "This school, it had a student go missing decades ago. A kid named Daniel Carter. One day he just vanished without a trace. No body, no leads. But there was a rumor. Some of the old staff said they saw something in the basement. Something that shouldn't have been there. Then one day the basement was sealed off and no one spoke about it again." I swallowed hard. "What does that have to do with the doll?" Mr. Harris hesitated. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. "Because that doll's been here since before Daniel disappeared. The school basement had been locked up for years. No one used it. No one even talked about it. But if there were answers, that's where I needed to go." I convinced Jake, one of the bravest students in my class, to help me. "This is insane," he muttered as we stood in front of the rusted metal door at the bottom of the stairwell. "But if Emily's in there, we gotta try, right?" I nodded, gripping the bolt cutters I'd borrowed from the maintenance room. The second the lock snapped open, a rush of freezing air hit us. The basement smelled like dust, mold, and something else. Something rotten. We stepped inside, our phone flashlights cutting through the darkness. The room was filled with old school supplies, broken desks, forgotten trophies. And in the middle of the room, a glass case. Empty. Jake whispered, "Miss, this looks like a coffin." That's when we saw the words etched into the wood. "The soul must remain sealed." A floorboard creaked behind us. We turned, and there it was, the wax doll, standing in the doorway, blocking our only exit. Jake and I froze. The wax doll stood in the doorway, blocking our only way out. Its glass-like eyes reflected the light from our phones, and its mouth. It was open now. A twisted, frozen smile stretched across its face. Jake grabbed my arm. "Miss, we need to move." I took a slow step back, my pulse pounding in my ears. The room felt smaller. The air felt heavier. Then, it moved. Not fast, not sudden, but deliberately. Its hand twitched, its foot slid forward, the sound of wax scraping against concrete. A whisper filled the basement. "Let me out." I didn't think. I grabbed Jake's arm and ran. We shoved past the doll, its waxy fingers brushing against my sleeve as I bolted through the door. I heard a sound behind me, something like a deep, inhuman groan. But I didn't stop. We sprinted up the stairs, through the empty hallways, and into the main lobby. The second we reached the front doors, we turned back. The hallway was empty. The doll was gone. The next day, the school basement was sealed off again. Emily? She was never found. The police investigated, but there were no clues, no leads. Just an empty hallway, and a girl who had vanished into thin air. I took time off work after that. I told the principal I wasn't feeling well, but the truth was, I couldn't be in that school anymore. 1 week later, I got a text message from an unknown number. No words, no explanation, just a photo. It was taken at Prospect Park, just a few miles from the school. It showed a wooden bench, and sitting on that bench was the wax doll, its head tilted, and this time, it was smiling at me. I was sitting at my desk, grading some math worksheets when I felt it. That weird sensation. You know, the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, like someone's watching you. Brookwood Elementary was usually a loud place. Kids laughing, pencils tapping, chairs scraping. But at that moment, everything just paused. The chatter faded. Even the air felt heavier. I glanced up. My students were scattered across the room, working on their assignments. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary except for one thing: Tommy. He was sitting a few feet away, staring at me. Not just a casual glance, a deep, unblinking stare. His hands were folded on his desk, his head tilted slightly, like he was waiting for something. I shook off the feeling and focused on my work. Probably just a kid lost in thought. But then I heard it. The quiet snip of scissors. At first I thought I imagined it. But then I felt something lightly brush against my neck. I reached up and my stomach dropped. A chunk of my hair slid down my fingers, landing on my desk. I shot up from my chair, spinning around. And there he was. Tommy. He was holding a pair of scissors from the arts and crafts station, his lips curled into the slightest grin. "Now it matches his," he whispered. My heart pounded. "Tommy, give me the scissors," I said, keeping my voice steady. He handed them over without hesitation, still smiling. That same unsettling stare locked onto mine. The other kids had gone quiet, their eyes darting between us. I could feel their unease. I took a deep breath and turned towards the window. But when I caught my reflection, I froze. The spot where Tommy had cut my hair, it was darker, almost dead-looking. At the end of the school day, I waited near the front doors, watching parents pick up their kids. Tommy's mom arrived a few minutes late, walking up with a bright, casual smile like nothing was wrong. I cleared my throat. "Mrs. Patterson, do you have a second?" She glanced at Tommy, who stood silently beside her, then back at me. "Sure. What's up?" I hesitated, not sure how to phrase it. "There was an incident today." Her smile didn't falter. "Tommy cut my hair during class." I kept my voice measured, expecting some kind of reaction. Shock, concern, maybe even an apology. Instead, she laughed. Laughed. "Oh, he's been doing that lately," she said, ruffling Tommy's hair. "He cut his own last summer, said he had to match someone." I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. "He's been talking about an imaginary friend," she continued, lowering her voice slightly. "Says this friend likes to whisper things at night. We just moved here, so I figured it was stress. Kids get attached to weird ideas, right?" She glanced at Tommy and nudged him playfully. "Did you want Mr. Carter to match your friend too?" Tommy didn't answer. He just stared at me, that same unblinking stare. That night I went to bed feeling uneasy. Maybe it was the way Tommy's mom had shrugged everything off. Maybe it was the way he had looked at me, like he knew something I didn't. I finally drifted off around midnight, and then I dreamed. I was in the classroom again, but something was off. The air was thick, suffocating. My students were sitting at their desks, but I couldn't see their faces, just blurry, empty features. I tried to move, but I was frozen in place. Then I felt it, a sharp tug on my hair. A whisper, barely audible, brushed against my ear. "Now you match." I woke up with a start, drenched in sweat. My hands flew to my hair, and that's when I saw them. Strands of my own hair, scattered across my pillow. The exact spot Tommy had cut earlier. It felt wrong, brittle, cold. I forced myself to breathe. Just a bad dream. Just stress. But deep down, I knew. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. The next morning, I arrived at school exhausted. I hadn't gotten much sleep after that nightmare, and the feeling of something being off hadn't gone away. As I walked into the classroom, I immediately noticed Tommy wasn't there. I checked my attendance sheet. Absent. That gnawing unease tightened in my chest. Something inside me told me that I needed to know more about him. During my lunch break, I went to the front office and asked for his student records. The secretary handed me a thin file, barely glancing up from her computer. I flipped through the pages, and then I froze. Tommy had been enrolled in 4 different schools in the past 3 years. Each time his parents moved without much explanation. But there were notes from previous teachers. Exhibits unusual behavior. Speaks of an imaginary friend frequently. An incident involving a teacher. Refuses to speak about it. Then I saw it. A police report attached to his last school transfer. I skimmed the page, my breath hitching. His former teacher had been found dead, at home. His hair had been completely ripped out. I had to know more. After school, I drove to the address listed on Tommy's file. The Patterson house was a plain, 2-story home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The lawn was well kept, the porch decorated with potted plants. I knocked on the door, half hoping no one would answer. It swung open. Mrs. Patterson stood there, looking at me with mild surprise. "Mr. Carter, what are you doing here?" I hesitated. How could I even explain why I came? I just wanted to check on Tommy. She studied me for a moment, then stepped aside. "Come in." The inside of the house was neat, normal. But the moment I stepped in, I felt it. That heavy, suffocating pressure. Like the air itself was thicker. Tommy's mom led me upstairs. "He's been feeling sick," she said. "Sleeping a lot." We stopped at his bedroom door. She hesitated, then finally pushed it open. The room was dimly lit. Tommy lay in bed, blankets pulled up to his chin. He didn't even look at me. But what really made my stomach drop, the piles of hair. Long, dark strands, tangled together in knots, stuffed into the corners of the room. Some of them were clearly Tommy's, but others were longer, older. And then, Tommy spoke. Without looking at me, he whispered, "He likes you." I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The piles of hair, the way the room felt wrong, and the way Tommy just laid there whispering, "He likes you." I swallowed hard. Who likes me, Tommy? For the first time since I entered the room, he turned his head to face me. His eyes were dull, lifeless, like he hadn't slept in days. Then he smiled. Not a child's smile. Something else was looking back at me through those eyes. And before he could answer, I felt it. A hand, cold, bony, and impossibly light, brushed through my hair. I spun around. Nothing, but I knew I wasn't alone. The room was buzzing with an unnatural silence. The kind where your ears strain to pick up a sound, but there's nothing. Just a deafening, suffocating absence of noise. Mrs. Patterson grabbed my arm. Her face was pale. "You should go," she whispered. I didn't argue. I turned and walked out, my legs shaking beneath me. But as I reached the front door, something stopped me. A single black hair curling at my feet. I bolted. That night I barricaded myself in my bedroom. I wanted to believe it was over, that maybe I had imagined everything. But then, at exactly 3:12 a.m., my phone buzzed. A message. No number. No contact name. Just a picture. I opened it with shaking hands. It was Tommy, standing outside my house, his head slightly tilted, that same empty stare. Below the image, just 2 words. "You're next." The sharp scent of chemicals lingered in the air as I wrote on the whiteboard, explaining exothermic reactions to my students. It was just another ordinary morning, until the classroom door flew open with such force that it slammed against the wall, rattling the windows. Every head turned toward the entrance. Brandon Keller stood there. His face was red, his eyes wide and unblinking, his breathing heavy. He gripped his phone so tightly his knuckles were white. The silence in the room was absolute. Even Jason, the class clown who always had a remark, sat frozen in his seat. "Are you serious?" Brandon's voice cut through the quiet like a blade. The way he was looking at me sent a chill down my spine. "Brandon," I started cautiously. "This isn't your class, you need to..." He didn't let me finish. Brandon stormed toward my desk, shoving an empty chair aside without a second thought. His whole body was tense, trembling with barely restrained anger. He thrust his phone toward me. "Put this to your ear," he demanded. I hesitated. "What?" "My mom wants to talk to you. Now." Before I could react, Brandon's arm wrapped around my neck in a vice-like grip. The pressure was immediate and suffocating. My vision blurred for a second as my lungs fought for air. Gasps filled the room. A few students shot out of their seats. Someone let out a small scream. "Listen to her!" Brandon roared, shoving the phone against my ear. A woman's voice shrieked through the speaker. "You think you can just fail my son like that?" I struggled, clawing at his grip. My own students sat paralyzed with shock, their faces pale. No one knew what to do. "I don't understand," I gasped. "The lab report," she snapped. "You gave him a 0. That was a full project, and you just erased his grade like he's nothing." My mind reeled. Lab report. We hadn't even done a lab this week. "That's not possible," I choked out, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Oh, it's possible," she hissed. "And I'm making sure you fix this mistake." Then, just as suddenly as it had started, Brandon released me. I collapsed forward, bracing myself against my desk as I coughed, desperate for air. Brandon took a step back, his face unreadable. The entire classroom was silent. Something was very, very wrong. Still shaken, I wasted no time. As soon as class ended, I marched straight to Principal Reeves's office. The moment I finished explaining, he sighed, rubbing his temples. "Carter, I think we're overreacting." "Overreacting?" I repeated, my voice rising. "He put me in a chokehold in front of my students. That's assault." Reeves leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Brandon's a good kid. His mother is very involved. I'll talk to him, but I think it's best we let this go." Let it go? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And what about the grade? I never assigned that lab. Reeves exhaled sharply. "It's taken care of. The grade has been removed." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean removed?" "You must have entered it by mistake." "No, I didn't." Reeves gave me a tired look. "Carter, this isn't worth the trouble." I left his office feeling even worse than when I walked in. That night I logged into the school's grading system. The entry for Brandon's lab report was gone. Not corrected, completely erased. I checked my lesson plans. No record of that lab ever being assigned. Panic crept in. Was I losing my mind? I decided to ask the other chemistry teachers if they had done a similar experiment. Maybe Brandon had confused my class with another, but when I asked, they all looked at me blankly. "We haven't done a lab in weeks," Ms. Daly said slowly. "But Brandon insists he submitted a report," I pressed. She shook her head. "No, Carter, there was no lab." That should have reassured me. It didn't. At home, I searched my emails for anything from Brandon or his mother. Nothing. No complaints, no assignments. Just nothing. If the report never existed, why did they both insist it did? The next day, I arrived early, determined to figure out what was happening. As I unlocked my classroom door, a voice stopped me. "You need to stop looking." I turned. It was Mr. Whitaker, the janitor. "You don't want to know," he said. "Just leave it alone." My pulse quickened. "Mr. Whitaker, did you see what happened?" He hesitated. Then, in a low voice, he muttered, "I've seen this before. People remembering things that never happened, and people forgetting things that did." "What are you saying?" But before he could answer, Principal Reeves appeared at the end of the hall. Whitaker straightened up and walked away without another word. Something was very, very wrong at this school. Determined, I stayed late at school, digging through old student records. What I found chilled me to the bone. Brandon's file showed multiple discrepancies. grades appearing and disappearing, teachers questioning their own memory. Then I found something worse, a document titled Faculty Incident 2017. It detailed a chemistry teacher, Mr. Andrews, who had gone missing after challenging an incorrect grade. No explanation, no follow-up. He had simply vanished. The last thing Mr. Andrews had written, a complaint about a lab report that never existed. As I prepared to leave, the hallway lights flickered. I turned. Brandon stood there. "You should stop," he said calmly. "Stop what?" I asked, throat dry. He smiled. "You already know." The room felt darker, the air was heavier. Then the lights flickered again. And in the brief darkness I saw it. A shadow standing behind Brandon. Watching. Waiting. When the lights came back on, Brandon was gone. And on my desk, a printed version of the erased lab report sat neatly folded. At the bottom, scrawled in red ink, "He knew too much." The next morning, Principal Reeves stopped me outside my classroom. "Carter, I need to ask you something." I braced myself. "Who is Brandon Keller?" My stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" I whispered. "I checked the records. There's no student named Brandon Keller at this school." My hands trembled. Inside my classroom, only one thing remained on my desk, a lab report with my name on it. The date? 2017. The year Mr. Andrews disappeared. Something wasn't just rewriting grades at Lincoln High, it was rewriting people. And I was next. I've been a pre-K teacher for 6 years now, and trust me, I've seen it all. Kids throwing tantrums, peeing their pants, eating glue. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for Elliot. It started like any normal morning at Jefferson Elementary in Boston. Parents rushed in, dropping off their kids before bolting out like the school was on fire. I was helping a little girl hang up her backpack when I noticed him. Elliot was small for his age, maybe 4 or 5, with pale skin and messy brown hair. He stood near the door, gripping his backpack strap so tightly his knuckles turned white. His dad, at least I thought it was his dad, stood behind him, barely stepping inside. He wore a worn-out baseball cap, his head tilted down like he didn't want me to see his face. "Hey there, buddy," I said, kneeling to Elliot's level. "First day, huh? You excited?" He didn't say anything. A sharp, sour smell hit me then. My stomach twisted. It was the unmistakable stench of human waste. I frowned and glanced at the dad, expecting him to say something. Apologize. Offer an excuse. Anything. But before I could even open my mouth, the guy clapped Elliot on the back and mumbled, "See you later, kid." Then he was gone, disappearing out the door before I could stop him. I looked down at Elliot again. His wide, dull eyes met mine. "Elliot," I said slowly, "did you have an accident?" He shook his head. That was when I noticed his clothes. His jeans were clean, but the waistband of his underwear peeked out just enough for me to see the dark stains smeared across the fabric. Something was very wrong here. By the end of the day, I convinced Elliot to let me help him clean up. But the next morning, when his dad dropped him off, the exact same thing happened. Same stained underwear, same rotting stench, same dead-eyed silence. I tried to stop the dad. "Hey, can we talk for a sec?" But he ignored me, again. Practically ran out of the classroom like he had a bus to catch. It kept happening. Every single day. I reported it to the school administration, but all they said was, "We can't force parents to take hygiene seriously." Seriously? This wasn't about hygiene. Something was wrong with this kid. Then the other kids started noticing. Elliot smells," one of them blurted out during circle time. The others giggled, scooting away from him. Elliot didn't react, not a single twitch of emotion. He just stared at the carpet, motionless. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something about him haunted me. The way his dad never looked me in the eye, the way the boy didn't act like any normal child. I had to do something. The next morning, when his dad dropped him off and bolted like usual, I made a decision. I grabbed the emergency contact form from the school records and dialed the number listed under Father. It rang and rang. Then someone picked up, but didn't say anything. I waited, listening to heavy breathing on the other end. I swallowed hard. Hi. I'm Mr. Thompson, Elliot's teacher. I was just calling to... Who? The voice was barely a whisper. Elliot, your son. A long pause. Then, in a chillingly flat tone, the voice said, I don't have a son. Click. The line went dead. My blood turned to ice. Who the hell was dropping Elliot off at school every morning? I sat there, gripping my phone so tight my knuckles ached. I don't have a son. Those words repeated in my head over and over. Maybe I dialed the wrong number. Maybe Elliot's dad was just messing with me. But something deep in my gut told me this was something else. The next morning, I didn't bother trying to stop the man when he dropped Elliot off. Instead, I went straight to the front office. Hey, Mrs. Carter, I said to the school secretary, trying to sound casual. I need to check Elliot's records, just making sure we have the right emergency contacts on file. She frowned. Why? Just a routine check. She sighed, pushing the paper folder toward me. You didn't hear this from me, but that kid gives me the creeps. I flipped through the paperwork. Everything looked normal at first. Name, date of birth, medical history. But then I saw it. Parent guardian Christopher Walker. Wait. That wasn't the name of the man dropping Elliot off. Then something else caught my eye. A note, scribbled in the margins, barely legible. Transferred. Previous name, Eleanor Walker. My hand started to shake. Eleanor? Elliot was a boy, wasn't he? The bell rang, shaking me from my trance. I stuffed the papers back into the folder and walked back to class, my heart pounding. When I stepped inside, Elliot wasn't sitting in his usual spot. I found him in the corner, standing in front of the mirror. His lips moved, murmuring something too soft for me to hear. I swallowed hard. Elliot? His head snapped toward me so fast it looked unnatural. His eyes were wide, too wide. And then, in a voice that didn't sound like a child's at all, he whispered, You know what I am now, don't you? I barely slept that night. I kept seeing Elliot's reflection in that mirror, the way his mouth moved before he turned, like he had been talking to something that wasn't me. First thing the next morning, I sat at my desk before the kids arrived and typed Eleanor Walker missing into Google. I wasn't ready for what I found. An old news article from 10 years ago. Missing child alert. 5-year-old Eleanor Walker disappeared from her family home in Boston. Parents found dead. Child never recovered. I clicked the link, my fingers ice cold. A grainy black and white photo loaded. A little girl with shoulder-length brown hair. Wide, dark eyes. She looked exactly like Elliot. No, not similar. Exactly. No signs of aging. No differences. It was like she had been frozen in time. The article said the police never found her body. The case remained unsolved. I pulled up Elliot's school records again. Date of birth, 2013. That didn't add up. Eleanor went missing in 2012. I pushed back from my desk, my breath shallow. Elliot wasn't just neglected, he wasn't just another tragic case of bad parenting. I had been teaching a missing child who was never supposed to exist. And someone, something, was bringing him to school every morning. I knew what I had to do. The next morning I waited. This time I wouldn't let that man walk away without answers. I stood outside the school entrance, gripping my coffee cup so hard I thought it would shatter. My heart pounded with every second that passed. Then I saw him. The man in the worn-out baseball cap. The one who dropped Elliot off every morning. He walked stiffly, like his limbs didn't quite work right, one hand gripping Elliot's wrist. I stepped in front of them before he could escape. We need to talk. The man stopped. Slowly, he lifted his head. His eyes, they weren't right. Dark, hollow, like something had scooped out whatever had once been inside him. He smiled. It wasn't a human smile, it was too wide. "You shouldn't have looked," he said. I swallowed. "Who are you?" His fingers tightened around Elliot's wrist. The boy didn't flinch, didn't react, just stared straight ahead. "That's not your concern." His voice was calm, too calm. I felt something wrong in the air around me, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. I forced myself to stay firm. "Eleanor Walker. I know the truth. I know she went missing." For the first time, Elliot turned his head. His lips curved into a smile, the exact same smile as the man holding his wrist. The man chuckled. "You think you understand?" I took a shaky step back. Something was wrong with both of them. Then Elliot spoke. "It doesn't matter now." His voice wasn't a child's voice anymore. It was older, deeper, like something else was speaking through him. The man bent down slightly, whispering in my ear. "She'll be back tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. You can't stop this." Then he let go of Elliot's wrist, and the boy disappeared. I blinked, my stomach lurching. The hallway was empty. The man was gone. Elliot was gone, like they had never been there. The next day, I waited at the classroom door, staring out at the school entrance. Elliot didn't come. I checked the records again. His name was gone, like he had never existed. I didn't sleep for days. I kept checking the news, waiting for some kind of update. Nothing. Then about a week later, I overheard something in the teacher's lounge. "New student starting today," one of the kindergarten teachers said. "Poor kid's been through a lot. Father died, mother's missing." My stomach dropped. I turned toward them. "What's the kid's name?" The teacher checked her notes. "Oh, Ellie." I felt the room tilt around me. I stood there, frozen, as the classroom door opened. A little girl walked in, small, pale, with shoulder-length brown hair. She looked up at me and smiled.